Hello YouTube! Today I'm going to discuss the biggest flaw with the Panasonic G7 camera paired with the 14-140mm lens, and that is shutter shock. Shutter shock is a phenomenon where the mechanical shutter shakes the camera and causes blurriness in the images. It's as if your hands were shaking, but in this case the camera is shaking even if your hands were completely still. If you use electronic shutter, there are no moving parts in the camera and there will also be no shutter shock. There are some downsides in using electronic shutter though. The biggest downside is that you can't use a flash with an electronic shutter. The shutter shock phenomenon is the worst in the area of shutter speeds that you would normally use with a flash, and that is from 16 to 160th of a second. Electronic shutter also suffers from rolling shutter effect, in which fast-moving objects are bent because the electronic shutter exposes the sensor from top to bottom. Here's an example of a fast-going car being bent because of the rolling shutter effect. Electronic shutter has been said to have a worse noise performance than the mechanical shutter, but I haven't noticed that at all, even when I was deliberately trying to test it. Next, I will go over all of these photos that I have taken with otherwise identical settings, the only variable being the mechanical shutter or the electronic shutter. These photos were taken with the focal length of 14, 46 and 140mm and with shutter speeds of 30, 60, 125, 250 and 500ths of a second. In the file names you can first see the shutter speed, then the focal length, and then the letters ES or MS. Here ES means electronic shutter and MS means mechanical shutter. First we are going to compare shutter speed 30, focal length 14. On the left we have electronic shutter and on the right mechanical shutter. And now I'm going to zoom 2 to 1 in the middle of this text. And when the shutter speed is 30, we can't really tell the difference between these photos. I could probably say that the electronic shutter picture is a bit sharper than the mechanical shutter picture. Okay, next, shutter speed 1/60th of a second. This is a lot blurrier than the electronic shutter picture. Next, shutter speed 125. And this is probably the worst picture for the mechanical shutter. This is clearly blurrier than the electronic shutter. This shows we shouldn't use the mechanical shutter when the shutter speed is 125, at least with the Panasonic G7 paired with the 14 to 140mm lens. Next one is 250th of a second, and again electronic shutter is a lot sharper than the mechanical shutter picture. Lastly, 1/500th of a second. It's harder to tell the difference. Neither one of these pictures is sharper than the other picture. Now let's move on to focal length of 46. First up, shutter speed 30. Here the electronic shutter picture is a bit sharper than the mechanical one, even though the shutter speed is just 1/30th of a second. Next up, shutter speed 60. Electronic shutter, mechanical shutter, and the electronic shutter is a lot sharper than the mechanical one. Shutter speed 125. Again we see the worst shutter shock phenomenon when the shutter speed is 125. The mechanical shutter picture is so blurry that you can see it without zooming in. Next, shutter speed 250. Electronic shutter is sharper than the mechanical shutter. Lastly, shutter speed of 500. And again, I can't really tell the difference between these two. I should note, however, that the mechanical shutter picture is a bit brighter than the electronic shutter picture in all of the comparison pictures. Next up, focal length of 140mm. And electronic shutter is clearly sharper with the shutter speed of 30. Next, shutter speed of 60. Again, the electronic shutter is a lot sharper than the mechanical shutter. The shutter shock phenomenon seems to get worse when you get to more telephoto angles. Next up, shutter speed of 125. Here the electronic shutter picture is tack sharp, while the mechanical shutter picture is very blurry indeed. Shutter speed 250. Again, the electronic shutter is a lot sharper than the mechanical shutter. I can see a bit of noise here because these pictures are taken with ISO 2500, but I think that the shutter shock has a worse impact on the image quality than the noise. Next, shutter speed 500. Again, we see a lot of noise because the ISO is 5000 in this photo. I think I can see a bit of blurriness in the mechanical shutter picture, but it isn't that bad considering we are zoomed 2:1. Conclusion time. I think the shutter shock is a real problem with the Panasonic G7. The shutter shock seems to be the worst when shutter speed is 125. When I saw the comparison pictures for the first time, I changed my camera setting to electronic shutter, and I have only used mechanical shutter a couple of times when I needed to use the flash. The Panasonic G7 also has an auto shutter mode, which changes between electronic and mechanical shutters, but it works unreliably. Sometimes it changes the shutter mode and other times it doesn't for no apparent reason. My Panasonic G7's firmware is version 2.0. I haven't updated to the version 2.1, but it doesn't seem to do anything about the shutter shock or the shutter auto mode. Like I said in the previous video, I still think that the Panasonic G7 is one of the best cameras in its price range, even if it suffers from such bad shutter shock.